Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is now episode 79 of the podcast. Before, myself on the Matthew Walk, and I'm joined again by Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali. And we're now going to do what could be probably called a part two of this discussion on the book, The Approach to Civilization of the Qur'an by Imam Muhammad Rahimahullah. So yesterday, in the last podcast we uploaded, that had to do with the Imam's life and his achievements and his legacy and his effect and the impact of his death, obviously. And now we want to go further on into the book. Al-Hajj.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. Wa ba'd. So I wanted to pick up from yesterday where we left off, and I wanted to now go into the book itself. Now I wanted to start by asking, why was this book chosen? Why was this the one that you chose to bring into English versus other books that the Imam had?
Okay. This goes back probably 3 years ago, this idea about this book. And I think at that time, I noticed that what was very much in vogue, so to speak, in the Anglosphere were these topics of like self-help, getting yourself in order, right? I mean, Jordan Peterson was very big at that time.
Sure.
This is before he got ill. And people were looking at, and there's his situation and that self-help movement, but there were also people talking about civilization, the end of Western civilization. Stephen Molyneux put out a book at that time as well about logic.
Right.
On the argument, and he talked about how Western civilization is falling apart because we don't know how to defend ourselves, we don't know what to accept, what to reject, and so on and so forth. So, again, I have one of my good friends of mine, we always have these discussions about these type of people in the West, and we think, okay, well, what are our own ulama saying? What are the Muslim scholars saying? How do they address these issues? And this book is a book that I picked up, I think I bought it in Morocco maybe several years ago, and I only read sections here and there. And I thought, yeah, this is this is a topic that we need to discuss and learn about and bring to the English language.
And what's the Arabic title of the book?
Al-Minhaj al-Hadar al-Insaniya fi al-Qur'an.
Wow. Okay.
So that's why this book was chosen, I think, in English, because again, there are so many misnomers and misunderstandings about civilization. So, for example, I think the most common ones, and this is what the Imam gets at, these ideas, okay, so why is Islamic civilization, in decline, or why is it sort of faded completely?
Yeah.
And why is, say, American or European civilization, why is that the ascendant dominant civilization right now?
Yeah, because you'll hear especially from spokesman Islam in the West, quote, what happened to us, and how did this occur, and where can we go from here, and changing our condition, and the state of the ummah, and these type of things.
I remember one quite horrific statement was like, why are we a defeated ummah?
Yes.
Right, and I remember we discussed this years ago, and you quote the hadith where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that we're an ummah marhuma.
Yes.
We're actually an ummah that Allah shows mercy to.
Yes.
We're not defeated.
Yes.
We haven't been wiped out. And so what Imam al-Bulsi gets into is he explains, rahimahullah, he explains why the situation is the way it is, and how do we truly understand it, and how do we get back to it.
Okay. So you've already explained then the reason for your choice, and you've also fleshed out the reason for the need for this book in English. What was the current Anglosphere understanding of scholarship on the topic at this time? Like where were sort of what we would call spokesmen for Islam in the West, or these other people that would call themselves intellectuals, or moderate Muslims? What was the sort of intellectual milieu at this time that they were looking at during the time that you were translating this book? Like what was set the stage for us in terms of what was the atmosphere like at this time?
I would say, from what I could gather, was, and I think you and I have discussed this before in previous podcasts, like the secular mindset that we did last year, what you would find is that these folks for Islam in the West, their idea was that they see themselves as more enlightened than these ulama that come from the traditional Muslim parlance. So Muslims that come out of these big ulama, these maraja that we look up to, that come from, say, Egypt or Sham or Iraq or wherever, or Morocco or Mauritania, they are, yes, they have a lot of knowledge and they're righteous, but they don't have a fully enlightened understanding of the world.
They don't understand our condition.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they don't fully understand what we go through in America and what we're trying to achieve, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to this understanding of reviving Islam, they wouldn't even consider that this revival would happen from the Muslim world. Right?
You know something interesting? I actually, when I look at this book, I kind of see this as the follow-up to me, just in my mind. I kind of see this as the follow-up to the Fiqh of Minorities article.
Yeah.
Like this is okay, listen, this is the full stuff. Like the Fiqh of Minorities was tackling a particular malady, and then I saw like this book is like, okay, this is everything. This is all of what the conditions are. The Fiqh of Minorities was like a part of the problem that people have, and then the approach to human civilization, that's all of our problems.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's true. I would definitely say that's true. That's what he's getting at. Because what these spokesmen for Islam in the West, you got to remember, they're by and large on that idea of, the Western sunrise. The
Yes.
sun comes in from the West, and therefore the revival of Islam will come from us.
Yes.
We're the vanguard, and we
Yeah.
have all these million ideas.
And sometimes they take the hadith that there'll be a renewer in every age. They take that to mean that, okay, this current renewer is the entire ummah.
Yeah.
Like the whole ummah is the mujaddid of this age.
And if it's not that, then it's one of their guys.
Yes.
Right. So they've had this idea that Islam will be revived from the West, and it will be their people, and they have the tools, and we can't really hope for much from the Muslim world itself, because these people are fossilized and they have ancient ways of thinking, and they're not enlightened. So what Imam al-Bulti is going to get into in this book is he's going to get into this discussion of how we understand civilization, and how our understanding of civilization is not the same as the Western understanding, because there's Orientalists who have these understandings, and that's what we're getting on in our next talking point, because one of them was this German Orientalist or anthropologist,
Oswald Spengler.
Yeah, Oswald Spengler.
Yes.
So he's
he was a really eccentric character.
Yeah.
Because I have his discussion on civilization, and he predicted the collapse of Western civilization, and he's almost on point. Like every civilization has within it the seeds of its own destruction. And the things that he quoted, like what he mentioned about American civilization, which is kind of an interest to me, when he discussed this, like he mentioned, like increasing surveillance, loss of constitutionality, big government, the increase in military. I was like, whoa, look at all this stuff. So it's like people can study civilization and sometimes figure this stuff out, but I think he fell short in some of the ways regarding Islam.
Yeah, because his understanding is like a sort of understanding is that he sees civilizations as organic. They sort of the life of civilization mimics the life of a human being or any other living organism, right? So it starts off weak, it grows and it grows and it grows, and then it reaches a peak, it reaches this crescendo, and then it weakens and blah blah blah, declines, and eventually disappears. And once it disappears, there's no way of getting it back, right? So what Imam al-Bulti explains is he says that no, there's basically there's a civilization that's built upon the Qur'an, that's built upon revelation, and there are civilizations that are built upon kufr and man-made ideas. So any civilization that is built upon kufr and man-made ideas is bearing the seeds of its own destruction within it.
Okay.
Right? Because it's not actually based on truth, it's not based on revelation, it's not based on connection to Allah, it's not based on a connection to Sunnah.
So in one portion, I'd say maybe half of Spengler's thesis he agrees with. in that, okay, if it's a Kafir civilization because it's not rooted in revelation, it bears the seeds of its own destruction. But a Muslim civilization, it doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
If
No,
they turn in repentance, they change
Yes.
their conditions,
Yes.
they maintain their righteousness, they don't have to be destroyed.
Yeah, exactly. So he says a Muslim civilization can always be revived because the tools are there.
Sure.
So right, and obviously if Muslims down their tools, they ignore those tools. Yes, that civilization will decline and go and fade away. Right. So if Muslims do, or if we look at certain Muslim empires, if they turn away from Islam and then they embrace communism, or they embrace socialism, or they embrace Mazdaism, whatever it is, then yes, that's what we can look at. Again, I mean, we've been talking a lot about mushahid in the past few days. You just have to read the history of the Arab world the last 100 years, and you've seen what Arabs have done.
Yes.
How they've tried to turn to communism and to socialism, and what's
failed.
What's the consequence? What's the end product of all that? So, because Muslims have that. We have revelation. We have these basic tools. All we have to do is go back and to look at the way of the Sunnah, the way of the Khulafa Rashidin, the way of great rulers like Saladin Ayyubi, Umar Abdulaziz, all these great people, and we can see, okay, how did they bring Muslims back, right? And again, it's not always on, like as we all know, it's not always on, say, the military level.
Sure.
It's also on the scholarly level. It's on the purification level. So we can look at the works of, for example, Imam Ghazali and Al-Muddin. You can look at the works like Najmuddin al-Maqdisi, right? What he did after the Mongol invasion.
Yes.
Is that correct? Right. So, bringing people back to Allah. There's an underlying cause there is this connection to Allah. So, one of the stunning things, and we should probably talk about this again in detail, but one of the stunning things that Imam al-Bulti brings up in this book is he talks about how usually in the West, when people talk about civilization and when they talk about Muslim civilization, they always talk about material things, right?
Speaking of which, hold that thought, and I think it will be connected with my next question. We've used this word civilization, I think probably 4 or 5 times since we started the podcast. The Imam's definition of civilization is preface. Could you kind of sort of give an etymological outline and explanation of his usage and why he chose to define it the way he did, and what should we understand from civilization?
Okay, so his idea, because again, the word in Arabic that we're using is hadara,
Okay.
right, which also comes from hadara, which means to be present, right? So it has this, so it automatically implies
Settledness.
Yeah, sedentary.
Rather than bedawa, which
Yeah,
is Bedouinness.
right? So you're actually staying somewhere and you're building up. You're doing like imara, right?
Yes.
You're making buildings, you're making roads, you're making masjids, you're making schools, you're making universities, hospitals, and the rest of it. But he goes to a deeper understanding. He says, no, what we're looking at is it's a combination of the understanding of who is man, what is life, what is the universe, and then it's the interaction of these 3 elements. And this is how you produce a settlement. This is how you produce a proper civilization. This is how you produce a true human civilization. So this is something we're going to dive into later. But the problem with when people look at civilization, and especially the way Orientalists have looked at Islamic civilization, is they just say, okay, look at the calligraphy the Muslims produced. Look at the masjids they built. Look at some pottery they made.
The tangibles.
Yeah, the tangibles. All these kinds of things. They're not really looking at the great books that Muslims wrote, right? You go to any
because those books are tangibles, but they're coming from intangibles of things like taqwa and yaqeen.
Exactly. So if you go to any sort of quote unquote Islamic museum in Europe, when I've done this, I went to one Islamic museum in Copenhagen a long time ago. I remember the only thing you can see there is calligraphy, artifacts, such and such. There's nothing really deeper. So one of the things that Imam al-Bulti gets, this is kind of the shocking point that was which really completely demolishes this notion, is he says, and this is true, one of the most, I think, if not the most visited tourist site in Europe, one of the most visited tourist sites in Europe is what's called the Alhambra.
Yes. The
Alhambra Palace in was that Cordoba or Granada?
Granada,
right? Alhambra in Arabic, and he says that the Europeans go there
And when they go there, they think, oh wow, this was when Muslims were at their peak. When their civilization was at their peak, they built this. Wow.
Yeah.
But Imam al-Bolti says, no, that building, that structure is actually a sign of Muslim decline. That is a sign. That is when Muslims lost sight of what the real goal was. They took their eye off the prize, took their eye off the target, and then they started
became ostentatious.
Became ostentatious, and their focus was no longer about pleasing Allah and everything for Allah's sake, but now it was about, we need to, like you said, we need to be ostentatious, we need to show off, we need to look at us, and again, you just have to look at that, and then you compare that with, say, the way the Khulafa al-Rashidun lived.
Yes.
Right, where I think like Umar al-Khattab, like he would be, and that's one of the things he puts in this book is like this statement of Umar al-Khattab when he was going to Jerusalem, and then one of the companions said to him, because he had patches on his clothes,
Yes.
and one of the companions said, "Is this how you're going to go?"
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're going to meet the leaders of the Christians and so forth. And he said, "No, nahnu qawman azna Allahu bil Islam." Right,
Yes.
we're a people that Allah has made us mighty through Islam. And if we seek, if we seek izzah in anything else, Allah is just going to humiliate us.
And the really powerful thing about that is that when Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he gets to Jerusalem and he meets the patriarch doesn't know that it's him yet. And he assumes Umar radiallahu anhu is a monk because his clothing is more shabby in his mind than his own. Because the patriarch of the Jerusalem church, he's wearing like a crown and silk brocade and everything else. He says, Omar, he says, "Oh, is this one of your monks?" He's like, "No, this is actually our ruler." And so he was thrown back because he thought, how can that be? He's dressed more humble than us, and he's a ruler.
Yeah. So but that tells us again that someone like Umar al-Khattab and these other great rulers that we've had is that their priority was always the afterlife. Their priority was always, they're not doing this because they want their name to be out there, or they want their name to be remembered for all of history. They're not seeking to be marfu',
Yes.
to be raised and elevated. They're seeking, they're humble before Allah, and Allah raises them.
Now, I also hear when the word civilization is used, I hear another word that's often mentioned or coupled with it. That's the word culture.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference? And if the Imam in his text has mentioned this or gone through this, what is the difference between civilization and culture? Because in the preface, as I was reading through the preface, it looked to me that there was like some type of difference between like civilization and culture. It seemed to me that he was drawing some type of distinction between these two things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I think that when we talk about civilization and culture, sometimes people say, well, they both go together, or that civilization is downwind of culture. Some people say culture is downwind of civilization. But it seems like he's not viewing them as coupled together. He's viewing them as like two separate entities.
Mm-hmm.
Like one is like a product of the other. Like culture is like a product of civilization, or one is the product of the other.
Yeah, because culture is going to be more likely a product of the civilization. Because if we go into the definition of civilization, which is this interaction between man and life and the universe and how we understand them, which is, again, that's coming up. Whereas culture, and this is one of the things that Imam al-Bolti, and I have a few videos on this, and there's some blog posts on this, whereas culture and these other words like traditions, culture is simply something that's passed down from generation to generation.
Right.
And that's what gives it legitimacy.
And it may not be like culture being passed down from generation to generation. As they're passing on these things, they might not know what they're passing on, but civilization seems to be something more deliberate.
Yeah.
And purposeful, like you're building up something.
You're
definitely moving towards like a goal.
Yes, because you know exactly what you're trying to do, and you're trying to revise something and bring about.
Culture might be more inadvertent. Like you're passing down a custom of certain foods that you eat. You might not know whether those foods are healthy or not, so it's kind of inadvertent.
Yeah.
Some of it might be purposeful, but some of it might be inadvertent. But civilization seems to be, from what the Imam is mentioning, much more deliberate and purposeful, like it's driving towards a goal.
Yeah, and it's going to be more deliberate when it's actually written down, and when it has a revelatory source. So, I mean, again, if we think about, like you take America as an example, like when those quote unquote, when those founding fathers, when they write the Constitution, they have there's a goal in mind, right? They have like a vision in mind of like, this is how we want our country and our civilization to look. These are our legal sources, and this is what our buildings are going to look like. They have all these things laid out. We have the Qur'an, and what he's getting at, Imam Multi-Lot, is people are going to say about the Qur'an, they're going to say, well, it's a religious book, and it just has stuff to do with religion. It has prayers, and it has moral about
man's day-to-day.
Yeah, there's nothing really about building a civilization, right? But what he gets into is he says, he quotes several ayat about where Allah talks about, like قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, right? The one who purifies his soul is going to be successful. That this is the crux of it. That once you've purified yourself, and Muslims collectively are purifying themselves, and they're closer to Allah, then that success comes, and Allah will give you true victory. It's so obvious, but it needs to be repeated. It's something that Imam Ghazali said in the Ihya al-Muddin, is a statement where he said that before you deal with the dog outside on the street, you need to deal with the dog in the backyard. Before you deal with the dog in the backyard, you need to deal with the dog in the house. Before you deal with the dog in the house, you need to deal with the dog in your heart.
Wow.
That, most Muslims want to sit there and complain about all these external enemies.
Yeah.
Right? All the Americans are doing this, the Israelis are doing this, the British are doing this, and so on and so on and so forth. Or, there's all these, right-wing movements and the neo-Nazis and so on and so forth. But it's okay. But what about your internal enemies? Like if you're not going to work, if you're not going to work towards defeating your internal enemies, your external enemies, your external enemies will always have it over you.
Yeah, if you can't defeat yourself, if you can't conquer yourself, you never conquer your enemies.
Yeah. So how can you go into like war against these people and fight these people if you can't even get up for Fajr? Right? You can't even get out of bed. You can't go to the masjid. You can't do these things. No, it's an internal problem, and that's what he's really trying to stress a lot. Like you want to get to the baseline of this book is the fact that Allah has commanded us to purify ourselves. Allah has commanded us to I don't know, you put us just to get things right with Allah, get things right with your Lord, and then you're going to see changes on a wider scale, right? If you really want to see, like success in your business, or you want to see success in your marriage, or you want to see success with your kids, you need to get these basic things right. If you're all over the place with your prayers and your basic obligations and avoiding the haram and sticking to the halal, forget about it. Forget about all these other issues.
You have no chance to go forward. Now, I wanted to discuss another topic that he went into, which was civilization as elements. Now, in terms of civilization as elements, he contrasted between nomadic and sedentary life. And in the course of doing that, he then said that civilization brings two trials to men.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, how could civilization bring trials to men? Like, what does he mean by civilization bringing a trial? But first of all, before then, what is the link? What link was he making when he was like contrasting nomadic life with like sedentary life? Like, what's the purpose of that?
Because like we said before, when you are, because he's talking about the command from Allah to build up the earth. Right. That's why Allah's put us here for Imara, and that's going to imply obviously that you're going to be sedentary. When you're nomadic, you're not actually building anything, so to speak, right? You're constantly moving, and you're on the road, and
if you do build it, it will be temporary.
Be something temporary. So there's something we have to be doing where we're getting, where we're putting ourselves in a sedentary state, and therefore everything that comes with it. But as for these trials, because I think again maybe you can answer this question for me. I believe Ibn Khaldun talked about this as well, because he praised the nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because the idea that when you're a nomad, you're completely self-sufficient.
You have a certain level of freedom. Strength.
Yeah, and you have to rely on yourself for everything. You rely on yourself for your security. You rely on yourself to procure your food. You rely on yourself to take care of your medical needs. All these kinds of things. You're not relying on anyone else to do anything. And then when you get into this sedentariness, that it can weaken you, right? That was Imam Ibn Khaldun's like cycle. That a nomadic tribe can easily go into a city and just take over those people because those people have been weakened. Yeah. They're not used to fighting. They're not used to ruggedness. They're not used to a rough life, to like a hardship in their life. They move in, but then they get settled in.
And some of them have forgot the stratagems of war as well. Because, so it's like their swords have become like plowshares.
Yeah.
So like plowing the earth and other things. But they've forgotten like skills like hand-to-hand combat and other things. They've left archery and things like this. So it's like they become sitting ducks, for lack of a better word.
And then, and then maybe 1, 2, 3 generations later, another tribe comes along.
Yeah. Right? Swept away.
Swept away.
Yeah. Now, what he said, and it's on page 33, he said something that grabbed me. He said, the answer is that the trial that civilization brings to mankind goes back to one of two reasons. So we call it a trial. He said, the first reason is the frivolities of the human soul and its whims. For by its very nature, if it is left to itself, it will make its bearer spread the causes of oppression and tyranny and ignite the fires of wickedness and tribulation on the face of the earth. At that point, scientific possibilities and human capacities becomes weapons in the hands of their bearers, igniting more than those fires. That just struck me dumb when I first read that. I was like, what? What's the significance? How's all this tied together? How can civilization become weaponized?
Because it becomes a power base. I think this goes back to something else he said. Because again, once you're settled somewhere and you actually have a territory and you're ruling over a territory, that's when everything changes. Because again, there's in one of his books, Al-Jihad fi Islam, كيف نفهم وكيف نمارسه, like how do we understand and practice jihad? Yeah. And he was asked this question about why are Muslims not fighting in Mecca, right? There's no battles between Muslims and the mushrikun in Mecca, but it does happen when they move to Medina. And he says, because in Medina, you have a completely different setup. In Medina, you've got 3 elements. He always talks about 3 elements. You have 3 main elements. You have a governing structure. So the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the ruler. Right. You have territory. You have geographical territory that you rule over, and then you have people. You have a jama'ah living on that territory.
Got it.
Right. So now they're going to be attacked. Now they're vulnerable to be attacked because that's how you can you attack someone if you don't have territory? Right. If you don't know where they are and where they're based, how do you attack them?
There's nothing to attack.
Right. So again, and that's like any country in the world where they have territory, there's a government, there's a populace, there's going to be an army somewhere. So once you get into that situation of where it happens, because again, how are you going to implement tyranny and oppression? Because this is what you just mentioned a few weeks ago. The Bedouin people, when they're living out in the middle of nowhere, they're constantly moving. The Egyptian government can't do anything to them, right? They're constantly on the move. They don't have an address. Where are you going to send the tax bill? Where are you going to
draft them into the military?
Yeah, because they're constantly moving, and they don't rely on you for anything. But once people move into the sedentary lifestyle, they're living in a city, and they have a home address, and the government's charging them taxes, and the government's charging for utilities, right? Now you're in a state of dependence to quite a degree.
And if you're not careful, it's like the government can slip in where religion is.
Yeah.
And it becomes like self-deified.
Yeah.
It's like deifies itself, slips in where religion is, and before you know it, it's like you're rendering the obedience to the government that you might normally give to your God.
Yeah.
And the loyalty that you're showing to the government is like what you might normally like give your parents. Like, like you trust them, and what they tell you don't do it, you don't do it. It's like I've seen people exercise in societies like these that are supposed to be free, the type of obedience that one should show like to their parents. Like just like, they told us don't do it, so don't do it. It's like subhanAllah. It's like only my mom or my dad could ever tell me don't do it, and I just not do it on the strength of like their statement. And then sometimes it's obedience to the point where it's like obedience that should only be shown to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
SubhanAllah. And then, but also just a minute on that point, like I know that like for example, I remember there's a book, Liberal Fascism, by Jonah Goldberg. He talked about how when Mussolini came to power, and he really stressed that idea of the state. He said the state is everything. There's nothing. Everything's inside the state, nothing's outside the state. And that's when the Vatican stepped forward. And they said, no, this is statolatry.
Yeah, state worship.
State worship. You've literally turned the state into an idol that people are worshiping, and everyone's turning to it, depending on this. And again, if you reflect on this sometimes, and I think about this a lot. I think this a lot. Some people, yeah, like you were saying, they do look at the state as some sort of, it's like a god, and people believe that the god, this state is all powerful.
Yeah.
It has
It's omniscient. It's omnipotent.
Yeah,
It's omnipresent.
Yes, it has unlimited resources.
That's
There's just endless money. They can fund everything. They can fund your education. They can fund because
and any failures in your life are for them to resolve.
Yeah.
Like I don't have it. The government should be making jobs. Like the government has like this conveyor belt.
Yeah.
That just creates jobs, and the government doesn't do this. It's the government's job to bring justice. And it's like no.
No,
The government's job to bring
and that's why you always had this situation where you could have an academic crisis, you could have a health crisis, all right, and the expectation is the government must do something. Yeah. The government must do something.
Where are they? It's like subhanAllah.
All right, we need to pass a law. We need to make this, and it doesn't work. And again, what you notice again, and they teach you this stuff at school. They I don't know if you did this when you were at school. I had this when I was at school. They asked this question like, if you could pass a law, what would it be? If you could do some, but there's this idea. There's a lot of people they literally believe that if a law is passed, that thing goes out of existence. If you outlaw something, it no longer exists. And you think, okay, why don't we go back to what they call the Old Testament? Thou shalt not kill.
Because there's still murder.
One of the oldest laws in existence.
It's like still murder. Now, I wanted to ask about this second reason, the second trial. He says in page 33, he says, quote, "The second reason is that mankind has and still is looking for the reality of both good and evil, without finding either of them. They have strayed away from them because they have fallen into the mazes of relative conventions and customs, and because they have not agreed on fixed standards for the means of both good and evil. One of the efforts of this is that civilizational efforts have become exertive experiments that contradict one another in most cases within the sphere of striving for what is presumed to be goodness and felicity for man. Out of these two reasons, what we call the problem of civilization appear in the history of human life, and the hidden secret becomes manifest, which is that human society is wretched in many epochs because of its civilizational endeavors, scientific efforts more often than it is felicitous because of them." Close quote. That just like, what? That just threw me off. It's like, it's mostly wretched.
Yeah.
It's like, what was the goal in like these two tribulations he mentions for man? It's like, what do we take away from like the second one?
Okay, so from the second one is, again, he's talking about civilizations that are not rooted in revelation. They're not rooted in revelation, they're not rooted in what Allah has commanded. And therefore, because they're not based on what Allah has commanded, they don't know what good and evil are. Right? It's like we were having a discussion the other day, that this is a very, very important theological point, and it comes up even in Usul al-Fiqh, where we say that Qubh and Hasan, right? Like, literally that's beautiful and ugly, but really it's good and evil. Like good and evil, the orthodox position is that this cannot be understood without a hukum, without Allah giving a hukum. If Allah does not give a hukum, we don't know whether something is good or evil.
Yes.
Right? The Mu'tazila differ. Yeah. The Christians,
because they say someone can know logically what's bad, and that's the era we're in now, where it's like, well, human beings decide what's good and evil. We decide, and we've decided that because this is what human beings agree on as bad, it is therefore bad. Yeah,
and therefore you get these ideas of how. So they're going to say stuff like, well, this is beneficial to human beings, therefore it must be good, and therefore it's halal, right? And there something is harmful, therefore it's obviously haram. Yeah. And that's why even in and this is an old idea. Even if you look at, say, American law, they have like these Latin statements where they'll say that something is malum. What's the term? Things like malum prohibitus and malum nc. So malum, so they'll say malum prohibitus means that something is bad simply because it's prohibited. Right? There's no other reason, right? So it could be, the government bans, lemonade sales unless you're registered or something, right? It's just malum prohibitus. Whereas like malum nc, they'll say intrinsically evil, right? It's intrinsically bad. I was like, what do you mean by intrinsically bad? Well, it's when a society can agree and see that this thing is truly bad. It's like, no. There's no such thing as intrinsically evil or intrinsically good. It all goes back to Allah's hukum. So because these people don't have it, people who are outside of revelation or using revelation, because they don't really know, they're always second guessing. This might be a good idea. Let's try. Whoops. so many people, died.
Yes,
Something got destroyed. Whoops.
there was this thing that we didn't count for because people took advantage of a loophole.
Yeah.
Now we've got to cover that over.
Yeah, look at communism. I mean, Karl Marx thought that would be a brilliant idea. 100 million people died. And people said, well, it wasn't applied properly. Maybe we should try it this way. Maybe we try this. Maybe if I was in charge, I wouldn't be Joseph Stalin. I would be different.
Yeah, well, everyone felt this way because they said, okay, well, that's not real communism. That's Bolshevism. That's Stalinism. So then, Trotsky tried to bring it to Mexico. It's like, well, this is Trotskyism. That's not real communism. It's like, okay. So then it's like the Arabs brought it. And it's like they brought their own. This is brown communism. And we believe in, Allah, but we're communists. It's like, and that failed miserably. And then it's like, the Central American communist groups. It's like, okay, has this ever on earth been implemented anywhere? Because every time we point to an example, say, okay, this is communist. It's like, yeah, but that's not real communism.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, what about the Arabs? No, that's not real. Okay, well, hold on. We've got Algeria, Libya, Tunis, Egypt, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. Yeah, but that's not real communism. That's the cult of personality. What about Stalin? That's the cult of personality. What about Lenin? That's the cult of personality. What about Mao Zedong? That's the cult of personality. Okay, what about North Korea? That's the cult of personality. Wait a minute. Has communism ever been implemented anywhere on Earth?
Yeah.
Right? Well, no. It's still waiting to be. So how can we follow it if we don't know it can be successful?
Yeah, and but it also goes to that premise where people think something could be good, and that's what was that an English statement where they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
Right. So people can think like, oh, this will be good, it'll work out, and then there's all these unintended consequences. That's like a law in economics, the law of unintended consequence, where all these things come about. So for example, like Marxism is based on this idea. It sounds really nice, where it says, each according to his ability, each according to his need.
Yes.
And that sounds wonderful. Like, oh, that sounds so nice, right? Each according to his ability, according to his need. Well, guess what? Now everyone is in need and no one is able. As soon as you make that statement.
That's it. And they're assuming that when they enact these changes that people's greed will disappear. Because people's greed is only there because they don't have their basic needs. Not realizing that there's some people that are greedy because they really are greedy and they don't want to share.
Yeah, because they totally ignore, they totally ignore just human incentive. They don't. So for example, I think a quality example. And this happens so many times. I mean, the most recent example that comes to me is that former French president, François Hollande, and he. So again, like all these governments out in the West, they have these budget deficits, and he says, oh, "Okay, I know what we'll do," because again, he looks at the tax revenue, and he can see how many people in the country are, millionaires and billionaires, the bankers, the famous actors, the sports people.
GDP and all that.
He says, I know what I'll do. I'll just raise the top bracket of income tax to 75%. And that'll close the gap. And 1 year from now, we'll have all the money we need. We'll be fine. As soon as he does that, as soon as it locks into place, I read one report, this was Daniel Hannan talking about it. He said, if you go to certain parts of London, all you hear is French. What's happened? It's like, yeah, all those French bankers, they moved. They left Paris, now they're in London.
Dug in.
They're working from London. They don't care. Gerard Depardieu was this French actor. He fled to Russia.
He renounced his citizenship.
Yeah, he moved to Russia. Putin met him at the airport and gave him a Russian passport and said, welcome. you're now a Russian citizen. Because Russia at that time, I don't know if they still do, at that time they had like a 10% flat rate of tax.
Yeah, it's so strange. Like, two people that have Russian citizenship, Roy Jones Jr. and Depardieu. It's like, where on earth would you find these people with citizenship? But they were brought there for the same reasons. This tax thing.
Yeah.
This tax thing and overburdening them with wealth. It's like, where on earth would you find Depardieu and Roy Jones Jr. together on anything?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. But it's the idea that these people have these good ideas, but you're actually treating human beings if they're rocks, right? It's like economics is like physics. It's like, okay, so if I drop a rock from a 100-story building, how long will it take to reach the ground, and so on and so forth. It's okay. Well, if I tax people, because the rock's not going to fight back. The rock's not going to grow wings and say, I don't want to fall.
Rocks won't protest.
They don't protest. But you say to a billionaire, okay, you work, and I'm going to charge you 75% of what you earn. He's not going to stay there. All right. So that's why. We mentioned Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun had this brilliant idea. They call it now in the West, they call it the Laffer curve, right? This idea where there's an American economist, Arthur Laffer, and he drew He drew this sort of curve where he said, okay, if you have 0% income tax, you have 0% government revenue. But if you have 100% income tax, you have 0% revenue, right? Because if you have 100% tax, why would you work?
Yeah.
Why would you? There's no point working. So he says, what the government has to do is has to find somewhere in the middle where he can maximize the tax and the revenue.
Yeah.
You have to find that balance. And then when he was asked about it, because I think they gave him a Nobel Prize for economics for this, right? People were really impressed, like, "Wow, you're a genius." And he stopped. He said, "Listen, it's not my idea." I'm like, "Where'd you get it from?" He said, "I got it from Ibn Khaldun." He admitted that he got it from Ibn Khaldun because Ibn Khaldun didn't draw the curve,
Yeah.
but he just made that point that
he laid the schematics.
yeah, he said if you charge maximum tax, no one will work. If you charge no tax, there's no revenue. So you have to find a balance. But again, people just don't think that they think that people will willingly work and give away 95% of their income, 100%. This is not going to happen.
Yeah, and they assume that when you do that to them, that they won't cut corners.
Yeah.
People will cut corners to stay alive.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got our portion. How does the Qur'an charge man with the responsibilities of building civilization? Now, under this portion, the Imam quotes, it's on page 35, he quotes a series of ayat.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, okay, he's quoted all these ayat. How are these ayat related? Like, could you explain to us, like, what was the methodological process, maybe, that the Imam used in, like, choosing these ayat over, say, any other ayat on the Quran on the topic of civilization?
Yeah, so on page 35, I quoted this ayah before. He quotes from Surah the 87th chapter, verse 14. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. He who has purified himself will have success. So this is like the core of it. This is like the nucleus of the whole discussion. This is where we have to start. And he gives other ayat where, like, Fir'aun says, and say, do you resolve to purify yourself, and I will guide you to your Lord so that you may fear him. When Musa said to Fir'aun, and say, do you resolve to purify yourself? Now, so the core here is that once we have purification of the heart as our focus, and we're looking at purifying ourselves and making ourselves better believers, we're bringing ourselves closer to Allah, we're improving our relationship with Allah, that means that we're defeating our internal enemies, as we discussed before. We're defeating our internal enemies, and therefore our external enemies are no longer be an issue. Right? It just reminds me of something you told me years ago about, like, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and Imam Mafquddin and these great ulama and these generals and these commanders. Like, what were they doing between, say, and again in the Gregorian calendar, between 1099, when the Crusaders take over Jerusalem, and the Battle of Hittin in 1187? What were the Muslims doing in that time?
Sure.
Right? They didn't go straight into battle with the Crusaders.
Not even after the Great Catastrophe.
Yeah, no. But instead, they dealt with. There's two main things they dealt with. Number one, they built, and this is something that also was mentioned by Imam Al-Busi in his other book on jihad. He says that Imam Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and Nuruddin Zengi, they spent that time building madrasas everywhere. They built madrasas all over Sham, all over Egypt, and then the army was made up of those people. The army was all Tulab al-Ilm. People who memorized the Qur'an, people who studied their basic fiqh, studied a lot of creed, studied hadith. That's who they raised.
This was the start of the Ayyubids.
Yeah, this is what they built. And then also, again, one of the things you made very clear to me back in the day when we were discussing this issue is that they took care of the cults.
Yes.
Right? These are internal enemies. Yeah. Like the what they call the assassins, the Hashishi.
That's it. Hashishi, you had Hassan Sabah, you had the Fatimiyya.
In Egypt, when Salahuddin al-Ayyubi arrived there, he just yanked them off the minbar in Jumu'ah.
Burst into the Jumu'ah, interrupted it.
Yeah. So, and that tells you something, that once you get rid of the internal enemies, success against the external enemy just follows through. So this idea of purification is absolutely crucial. And if we're not thinking about making ourselves better believers and getting ourselves in order and being disciplined with our worship, then none of this success is going to come.
Wow. Now, one of the things that he brought up that I thought was useful, that made me ask this question, okay? Does civilization, based upon the Imam's understanding, and you touched on it a little bit before, does civilization naturally mean material progress and development? Because some people think, oh, well, because we're materially successful, That means we must have a good civilization, we must be a good people, and we must be the best civilization simply because we have more stuff than everyone.
Yeah.
Right? So, does material progress and development necessarily mean that one has civilization or that their civilization is best?
Short answer,
Based
no.
upon the
Short answer is no. I mean that's basically the. Correct me if I'm wrong here. That's the Protestant work ethic, isn't it? Right. That's. I think I don't know if that's a big dominant. Is that the Church of England have that belief?
Some of them. I mean, it also goes hand in hand with the word of faith movement. That the reason why you're poor is you don't have enough faith.
Yeah.
If you had faith, then you'd be rich because God doesn't want anybody to be poor.
Yeah. So if God loves you, that means you're wealthy, right? And that's why you got these people like I was saying Joel Osteen. They're making like $40 million or they're living on because God loves them. Obviously, that's the argument, right? If he's a poor pastor, then so yeah. So Imam Abulti, I'm sure you know it's the book. He talks about this at length of how people look, for example, again America, right? This is the dominant economy. People look at America and think, wow, those guys have achieved so much. They've got so much wealth. They've got so many businesses going. So much produce. They're making movies. They're putting out books. They've got all these sports teams. They're putting out all these fancy gadgets and products. Look at all the cars. Look at all the televisions. But he says, but below the shining lights and the loud music, you don't see the suffering. You don't see the suicide rates. You don't see the drug abuse. You don't see the alcohol abuse. You don't see the broken families and the divorces and the suicide. You don't see all that stuff. That's all hidden. He says, so something's rotten underneath that.
Yeah, something's amiss.
Right.
Badly.
Right. So you're looking at thinking like, oh wow, it's so amazing from the outside, but then no, there's people living there in abject poverty.
You find out that there's places in the United States called Skid Rows where they hide their homeless people.
Yeah.
Now, immigrants, when they first come to the U.S., they're not shown the Skid Rows. They don't go there. These places are often hidden out of sight. And it's not until, as an immigrant, you get a keen eye that you know where certain parts of town are. Oh, this is where the homeless people are. Because people have been sold the myth that America has no, everyone's working, everyone's rich, it's raining money, and all these stuff.
Yeah, yeah, because people have this idea that all of America looks like Times Square. Yeah. Right. It just looks like Hollywood Boulevard.
It's like neon lights flashing.
Oh, there are slums, there are ghettos, there are
bad ones.
So yeah, so no, it has nothing to do with that. And I think to get to a more serious point here, because people look at that. So and again, Muslims look at that and they think, okay, well, Americans have McDonald's. Oh, then we should have McDonald's. Americans drive, GMC Sierras. Therefore, we need to get some GMC Sierras. Yeah. Americans watch all these movies. We need to watch all these movies.
They eat this diet, so we should engage in.
Yeah. We need to have Coca-Cola. Yeah. And it's interesting. I came across this word only recently. Reading some Twitter threads, and some guy could use this expression called cargo cult. It said cargo cult. And this had to do with I think this was during the war between the U.S. and Japan 60 years ago, or 70 years ago now. And there's the Melanese Islands, and the Japanese, and these are just simple people, right? They're not quote unquote civilized. They don't have. Yeah.
Islanders.
There's islanders. There's like village islanders, and they eat like fruits and fish, and that's it. So, but the Americans and the Japanese, they were using these islands as air bases, right? So they just take over the island, lay down an airstrip, put an airplane there, build a canteen, build stuff, right? And these guys, they couldn't understand what was going on, right? So the definition of a cargo cult is where you're looking at someone else using technology. You don't know why they're using it or how they got it about, but you just want to be like them. So what they did for the duration of the war is or however long their battle was, is both the Americans and the Japanese, they used these airplanes, and the Melanese were just like, wow, like, where do these people come from? Have they been sent by the gods? Where did they get this technology from? And then when the war is over, the Americans and Japanese pack up and leave. So the Melanese are left thinking like, how did this happen? Where did they go? How do we make them come back? So then what they start doing, using wood and very primitive materials, they start building their own runways. They start building like planes out of wood.
In the hope that they'll return.
In the hope that like maybe if we do it, they'll come back. Maybe if we, right?
That's heavy.
So you're sure trying so hard, but you have no understanding of why the Americans were there, why the Japanese were there,
What their motives were, and everything else.
So again, when I saw that word cargo cult and I read the definition, I thought, yeah, that's kind of like what we're doing in the Muslim world. A lot of people, you're looking at Americans, and you're looking at them eating McDonald's and drinking Coca-Cola and wearing Nike shoes and watching all these movies, and you're thinking that, yeah.
Those must be the keys to their success.
Yeah.
So if we do the same things, we will repeat the same successes.
Yeah, well, our economies will just magically transform. Just like the Melanese think, if we do this, the Americans will magically appear with all their fancy gadgets again. So that's the kind of the situation we're in, and it's all an illusion. It's all illusion because you're not looking below the surface and looking at the drug abuse, the suicides, and so on and so forth.
So then that kind of then ties up the discussion about religion and versus human development and progress, that someone, because they have human development and progress, because the society has that, doesn't necessarily mean that it's moral.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? And so that's something that I think is something to be understood. And I think that kind of permeates this book by the Imam. But I also wanted to ask about something else. There's a section headed, "How does the Qur'an enlighten man about the elements of civilization and show him how to cooperate with them?" He says this is the third and final introduction before starting the book. But, subhanAllah, I thought that I was well into the book. And then I've read this and I thought, wait, hold on, the book's not started yet? Why are there 3 introductions before the book actually, like, he has 3 introductions. What is the significance of, like, these 3 introductions before the book formally starts? Because I thought, okay, I'm well into the book, I've got all the fruit, I'm getting the fruit, I'm picking things up, I'm understanding, and it's like, now we've reached the third and final introduction. But so all that stuff before was yeah, all that stuff. Now we're ready to start the book, and the book comparatively after is like slim.
Yeah, well, it's about, what is it, about page 50? Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's done about a third of the, a quarter of the book is just introductions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is I'm not castigating it or anything else, but it's like, it seems like he laid like a huge amount of groundwork. It starts on page 47. It started on page 47. And I was like, so he spent all this time laying all this groundwork.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the book is like, is in comparison, it's like slim. Because the rest of it's carrying through with the rest of the book once it finishes this third introduction. So it's like, what's the significance of the fact that, is this his normal writing style? Like, he lays like a lot of groundwork.
Oh yeah, because he's really trying to, again, that's what you were talking about yesterday. As a marja, he's really trying not to jump into a situation, jump into a discussion before the reader fully understands what we're talking about. So, for example,
I mean, it looks like he's like defining terms.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, you take his other book, the other main book, Qur'an al-Kawni, about theology, right? That's a theology textbook, right? He doesn't just jump into it and say, okay, the attributes of Allah are this. Allah is wujud. Allah is mawjud. Allah has wahdaniyah. Allah is. He doesn't do that. He says, okay. He goes, rewinds it all the way back and says, okay, what is our scientific method? How do we ascertain what is true or not? How do we ascertain reports?
Etymology.
Yeah, so it's a long epistemological discussion. The whole first chapter is just a long epistemological discussion, which it's on my blog. You can read it. It's several pages. Then he talks about, okay, this is how the Muslims do it. How do the people in the West have it? How do these Westerners have it? What's their method? How do they ascertain reports? Do they even have anything like al-jarh wa ta'dil or ilm al-rijal or mustalahat al-hadith? They don't. Yeah. Then there goes into a long discussion about Allah's existence.
Yes.
How do we know Allah exists? He goes all this long, and then finally we get into, okay, what are Allah's attributes?
Now we can begin the book.
Right? Because, and what you'll find as well is that throughout Qur'an al-Kawniyya is he'll talk about Allah's attributes. Then he'll talk about the Prophet ﷺ and the attributes of prophets. Then he'll go into what he calls Kawniyat. He says he doesn't call them Sem'iyat in his book. He says because they're not things that are coming in the future, but they exist now, like the jinn, the malaika. Then he talks about human beings. Then he goes off in a long discussion about evolution theory. Yeah. But what he'll often do at times is he'll say, now, before I talk about prophets, I'm telling you, reader, you need to make sure you've understood the chapter about Allah. If you don't understand who Allah is and what He wants from human beings and the relationship with human beings, if you don't understand this, then you're not going to understand talking about prophets. We can't talk about prophets if you don't believe in Allah.
He's going in the order of Arkan al-Iman.
Yeah, exactly.
آمنت بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر وبالقدر خيره وشره. Right? He's good, like going in that order.
Yeah, and then when he gets to the end, when he gets to like Sam'iyad, when he's talking about Day of Judgment, the hellfire, the fire, the paradise, and so on and so forth. He says, now, this is really important. We cannot talk about this unless you understand everything we discussed before. You understand who Allah is, you understand what revelation is, you understand how we verify reports, what mutawatir means,
how we apply judgments.
Yeah, if you don't understand these things and how things are gathered and how we verify things, if you don't understand this, discussing the existence of angels is useless.
It's fruitless.
Discussing the existence of the Day of Judgment, the truth of the other Day of Judgment, the fire, the paradise is pointless. So he wants to build it up so that he doesn't want the reader to fall behind at any point. He's taking you by the hand. He's like I'm going to guide you through this step by step, so that you are not lost or confused. You fully understand what's going on.
And I think it also helps to stop readers or people who are researching on this topic from getting sidetracked, because sometimes unrelated questions can come in and sidetrack someone to the topic at hand. You know, we've either been one of those people that have perpetrated this inadvertently, or we have been someone who's been a victim of it, where we're discussing a particular topic and someone will bring in a question that completely diverts from that topic because they've misunderstood like the beginning. And so now you have to spend all this time like unpacking all this background knowledge before you can return to the topic at hand. And so I think by doing that, he kind of mitigates against that thing happening.
And again, he doesn't want people to come into the book, any of his books, with a lot of baggage or a lot of pre-existing conditions, or sorry, assumptions. People do all these assumptions, and so they read the book and they just assume they know what civilization means. They assume they know that.
That's it. And you can't make that assumption because people are they're of different and varying mindsets.
Yeah.
Now I want to look at the Imam's next part, because now he's formally entered into the book, and he has the approach to human civilization in the Qur'an. Okay. When the Imam talks about man, human race, who is man in the Qur'an?
Okay. In summary, the Imam makes it clear that man he's Allah's Khalifa on earth, as Allah in Surah Al-Baqarah. Khalifa. But at the same time, he's made from ma'an mahin. So there has to be this balance. So he says that as a human being, when you realize that you are Allah's Khalifa on earth, you're going to respect yourself. You're not going to accept humiliation. You're not going to accept debasement. You're not going to accept being a slave. And he gives the example of the Bani Israel in Egypt.
Okay.
He said they were in that state of just complete subjugation and humiliation under Fir'aun because they didn't realize that you're Allah's Khalifa on earth. Why are you accepting this?
They lost their self-respect.
Yeah, you don't have any self-respect. But then the other back point of this is this ma'an mahin, whereas you realize you're made from this vile fluid, that you don't become arrogant. And that's Fir'aun.
Yes.
Right? Where Fir'aun has no more than self-respect. He has self-deification.
Yeah. He forgot his origins.
Right? So man has to stay in that balanced scope where he realizes, okay, I'm going to respect myself. I'm going to better myself because Allah has honored me. Like Allah says in Surah Al-Isra, we've been ennobled as the children of Adam alayhi salam. But we're not going to be arrogant and think that we're invincible and that we're gods and that we're these amazing creatures. No, we're going to stay balanced. This is who insan is, and again, so this is an element of civilization. When man loses sight of this is when things go wrong. When you lose sight of this, then you can become tyrannical and oppressive like Fir'aun. And if you lose sight of the fact that you've been honored by Allah, then you can become just used to subjugation and humiliation and degradation like what happened to Bani Israel.
What is human life in the Quran?
Okay. So human life in the Quran, again, it's this idea of a balance. So he draws the analogy of like a final exam at university, all right, or a final exam in high school. I guess in the U.S. would be SATs or something, or
Finals week.
yeah. So he said. So he said this is an exam. It's an exam that you take at high school or university. It's very, very short, right? And compared to the rest of your life, it's very, very short. It's going to take, what, 2 hours?
Yes.
3 hours? But the effects, the consequences are profound. So how well you do in that exam, that's going to, like, for example, in high school, how well you do in those exams, that's going to determine what university you go to, whether you go to university at all. If you get to a good university, and then what university you go to, that's going to affect your career prospects.
That's why a lot of times in the U.S. they terrorize you by saying, "This will go on your permanent record." It's like following you around.
Yeah. So everything, because in a way there's truth in that, because like it's going to affect your career prospects. Your career prospect will affect your marriage prospects.
It dictates what trajectory your life will take.
Yeah. So it's the same thing with your life. Your life is short. You don't know how long you're going to live, 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever it is, but the consequences are profound and everlasting. How you conduct yourself in this life, whether you believe, you disbelieve, if you're a believer, your sins and so on, this is going to affect how things happen, or what will happen to the next life. There are long-term consequences. So that's how we have to see our life. Our life is not just this frivolous waste of time. We're just here to enjoy ourselves, and that's it. And then we die, and then we return to nothingness, and there's no. There are serious consequences here. Even though it might look like an insignificant period of time, it is a serious consequence, just like that university exam or high school exam.
What is the universe in the Quran? Because you hear all this talk, multiverses, universe, all sorts of stuff. When the Imam is talking about the universe in the Quran, in this book. What does he mean by universes? It seems to me that when I first read this, he's using universe in a very universal sense, that the creation at large.
Yeah, like wujud.
Yeah.
Or al-qawn.
The things that are present in our midst. Yeah.
And this is what. And this
for the word universe that he was using, did you translate that from like khalq? Or
I think
was
it was.
alam?
I think it was
the word alam.
I think it was kawn or wujud.
Okay.
Kawn or wujud mean like everything together. I wasn't there saying meaning like, yeah, and what all the planets and the stars and all that stuff. Yeah. That's why I chose the word. I wasn't necessarily getting into the universe multiverse argument.
Yeah, got it.
So I apologize to readers.
Got it. What is knowledge in the Quran? What he's talking about knowledge in the Quran. What's the significance of the Imam discussing knowledge in the Quran? Because I noticed that he's used the word ilm, or knowledge, to also mean science.
Yeah, because again, we don't have that in Arabic. We don't have the distinction in Arabic. That's the huge thing we talked about last year in the secular mindset. Because in English, you can do that. You can have this religion versus dichotomy, or religion versus science dichotomy. Well, those two separate things. And you're a religious scholar, and you don't talk about these issues. Okay. So
you it's like, yeah, you're a faqih and a mufti. What are you talking about vaccinations for?
Yeah, why are you talking about global warming? That's not science.
No, or this person's like, oh, you're a biologist. Who told you to discuss, geology?
Yeah. So this again, you put it back to Arabic. It's like, okay, so ilm and deen are two separate things. Yeah, all right. I mean, the kufr of that is just so manifest.
Yeah, it's like, no, we're not doing that.
So if you said that, no, deen is not ilm.
Yeah, you just get blanked.
Yeah,
because that is the shower. That is the shower.
Yeah. So his point here, Imam al-Bulti, about knowledge, and I think there's two real important points here, but I think the second point is coming in the next talking point, is the fact that knowledge is intertwined and interconnected. Mm-hmm. So what he says is, knowing knowing one science is not beneficial if you don't know how those sciences are connected to everything else and all the other sciences. So he says, we discussed this example yesterday in a private conversation, that if you have a map and you hold a magnifying glass up to a map and you can find this city that you want to go to, like, okay, so I want to go to London. Oh, look, I found London on the map. That knowledge itself is useless if you don't know where you are on the map, if you don't know what direction that is. Okay, so this is that north? Is that south? Is that, you have to figure this stuff out. If you can work out, for example, you can look at the movement of the sun and say, okay, well, that's the sun setting over there. Okay, so that's the west, and that's the east. Okay, that's good. But you're in the United Kingdom. That's useless unless you actually know that the Qibla is in a southeasterly direction. So you have to look at the whole picture. And what's happened here, what's gone so wrong with all these quote unquote sciences and knowledges in the West, is that it's all compartmentalized. So someone is he knows all about history, but he knows nothing about literature. He knows all about geology, but nothing about biology. He knows all about botany.
So they don't see the interconnectedness.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that John Taylor Gatto in his book Dumbing Us Down, he was a school teacher for 30 plus years in New York State. He said we teach the disconnectedness of everything. That's what we you put you in the classroom for 45 minutes. We shove all this geography down you, and then the bell goes, class dismissed. 5 minutes later, you're in physics. And you're never ever taught like how to put those parts together. Like,
and that's done with like purposeful intent.
Yeah, and that scrambles your brain, it screws you up, and then you get all this cognitive dissonance going on, and you don't know how anything fits in with other matters.
Now, under the next chapter, the Imam discusses the fossilization of Islamic civilization. Now, it's interesting that he chose that point because you'll hear a lot of reformist movements use this type of expression. Could you sort of give us an outline of how, before we talk about the Imam's characterization of the Ummah, how other movements characterized the state of Muslims and how these other movements sought to resolve the Ummah's condition?
Okay, well, there's this notion out there that, that's one of the things he discussed in the book. There's this notion out there that Muslims are in this quote-unquote backwardness because they are isolated and they've cut themselves off from Europe, or they've cut themselves off from America, and they're very insular, and they're not taking on new ideas and new inventions and so on and so forth, which is complete and utter bunk.
I see.
Because, again, we're talking about mushahada again. I mean, look, we have TV, we have the internet. Anyone can go on their phone now and have access to American culture, the news in America, the news in Europe. People in the Muslim world, especially in the Arab world, they're sending their children to study these countries, right? You go to the Arabian Peninsula, so many people have studied English in the UK, in California, in Florida. So many people. Even in Morocco, there's so many people that they've been to France.
Poor people.
They've been to Spain. Even poor people. They've been to these places. They're not cut off. They speak French. They speak English. They go to these countries. They're not cut off from, that great source of civilization, i.e., Europe and America. Right? That's a completely false notion. And of course, the other false notion is not just lack of contact, but that's also going to talk about this lack of willingness, and we need to, and this is where you get people like Taha Hussein, these ideas like we need to become European,
yes.
we need to get off the shackles of all this dogma that we've been attached to. Muhammad Iqbal, and one of these founding figures of Pakistan, he had the same stuff. He's praising the Turks because they've thrown off the shackles of dogma and are entering the modern age. He's praising Ataturk. Right, so as these people go headlong into secularism, right? Because again, there's a lot of people holding these ideas that secularism is the way forward, and we need to discard Islam because it's just backward and it's holding us back.
And the interesting thing about the people that, as a point before you continue, is like all the people that have come to those conclusions, the countries they live in are still third world countries.
Yeah. Even
though they've embraced these ideas, their countries are still in absolute degradation.
Yeah.
Still.
So
that can't be the issue.
Yeah, that's why Imam al-Bulti, because he talks about how, again, how we're going to build ourselves up again. We need to learn about morals. We learn about manners. We need to improve ourselves as people. And he says, but there are these other, engineers who are saying, no, we just need to learn about machines. We need to have factories. And then Imam al-Bulti says, No, look at the Muslim world, right? We have thousands of factories. We have thousands of engineering colleges. We have thousands of pharmacology institutes. How has that changed things? Right? You go somewhere like Jeddah, every single pharmacist is an Egyptian. Every single pharmacist in Egypt. You won't meet a French pharmacist or American. Every single pharmacist is Egyptian, right? Everyone there is. From my experience, especially in the Arab world, a lot of these people, the Arabs are not short of this professional class
or confidence.
Yeah, they're not lacking engineers. They're not lacking doctors. They're not lacking pharmacists. All these things are readily available. All these types of people are readily available. But how come there's no change? How come we're not this great glistening civilization? Because we're not looking at our morals, we're looking at our manners, we're not looking at our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's our problem. So, the way he balances it out, and I think of this point about, or did you want to talk about the movements?
You gave a good layout of all these movements, because whether we're talking about Hizb ut-Tahrir or Al-Ikhwan or all these other movements, that's pretty much the gist of their thought process. The solutions offered by the Imam, because people, when we see that all of these movements that have ever deduced this understanding that Islamic civilization is in a state of disrepair and needs to be brought back or whatever else, they've all failed to deliver on their promises.
Yeah.
But then we have the solutions offered by the Imam. So I'd like to look at those, because his ending chapter is, how can Islamic civilization be resurrected?
Yeah.
So I'd like to know about the Imam's solutions going forward.
Okay. So what we're looking at here is the fact that, like the Imam said at the beginning, that the tools, the actual tools of revival, are there already, right? So when you look at these movements where people are talking about, oh, we need to just become secular, or we need to become communist, or we need to completely overthrow the madhabs, or so forth. When you go along that route, that road, you're removing all the tools.
Right.
You're taking the tools of our revival, you're just throwing them away.
You're actually sabotaging the tools of your own resurrection.
Yeah. So it's like it's like you're looking at a house, like your own house, and your roof needs some work on it, and you're thinking, okay, I need to just take out the foundations. Right?
I'm knocking down the walls.
Yeah, I'm going down to the basement and just hammer those foundations while I'm in the basement. That's what you're looking at. You're not actually seeing it. So what he does is he then talks about a really, really important point, and I've written about this on my blog, and I talked about this book and the Civilization as a summary, is the importance of a confirmation bias, right? So a confirmation bias. Now, people hear the word bias, they think, oh, it's not objective. No. A confirmation bias is like a healthy digestive system. So when you have a healthy digestive system, when you eat food, your digestive system is going to figure out, okay, this is good for the body, we can use this, we can replenish our muscles, we can replenish our cells, and so on and so forth, and this is no longer used to us, and that gets excreted out. Yeah. That's what a healthy digestive system does, right? If it's unhealthy, and it just accepts absolutely everything, you get constipation. Yeah. If it rejects absolutely everything, because you have amoebic dysentery, it comes out as diarrhea. Yeah. Right? So it says we have to have, so he talks about, we have all these ideas coming from the West. He says we're not cut off from them. But whether it's the West, whether it's the East, whatever, all these ideas are coming to the Muslim world. Who's the filter? Like who acts the filter and says, okay, that's a good idea, we can use that. No, that's a bad idea, discard that. Who's doing that? Yes. And that's why, in that summary I wrote on my blog, I said, well, the role of that would obviously be the Maraja. They're the ones who are in a position where they can say, okay, that's a useful idea, that's useful technology, we can use that, that might have some benefit in
sifting.
That might have some benefit in designing buildings and engineering.
It's a process of sifting.
It's a process of sifting.
Sifting.
But we don't have that. He said, really our situation now is that we're taking on so many ideas from outside the Muslim world, from the West, from the East, whether it's the U.S., whether China, we're taking all these ideas, and we're not questioning them. We're just taking them, oh, we'll try that, oh, we'll try that, oh, we'll try that. And no one's stopping. So we need to get back into
a filter mode. That's what's good about a confirmation bias. We need to have that healthy digestive system.
Well,
Because right now we're like there's a constipation.
we're just eating any and everything.
Yeah, we're just accepting everything that comes our way. Oh, the Americans said it. We'll do it.
That's it. Wait a minute, hold on. They said, yeah, we'll do that too. SubhanAllah.
So we have to get out of this imitation phase. We're just imitating people. We're not actually being creative ourselves. We need to have that confirmation bias and have our own ideas and create our own ideas, or take other ideas and adapt them. If there are other ideas, take them and adapt them and improve them. Why are we just waiting for them to tell us what to do?
Yeah.
And then to this point about why are the Americans or the Europeans, why are they in that situation now and we're down here? It's not because they have something better. There's something about this civilization that's superior to Islam.
Yeah.
That's complete bunk. He says, really what's happening is that we are able.
Yeah.
We've abdicated our authority. We just walked away. We're no longer interested in running the world and running the world's affairs. We're no longer. So someone else has to take over. That's it. So the Americans stepped up because no one else would.
Yeah, because when there's a vacuum, no one's going to let things descend into complete chaos.
Yeah.
It's like, and it happens no matter what environment you're in. People step up. It's like if both parents fall ill, one child steps forward and becomes like the parent.
Yeah.
Right? If there's the supervisor's gone from work, the assistant supervisor steps in. It's like, so in the same way in safeguarding the world's affairs, if people slacken their obligations and shirk in their duties, then another nation steps in and fills that spot.
Yeah, so that's literally what we're looking at. We're in this situation because Muslims have, by and large, they've just not stepped up to the plate. And another thing he talks about, because he lists in the book, he lists several ways that to address this problem. Well, I think one thing that really stood out to me, I was just reviewing it a little while ago, is he said that if we really, really want to have a revival, then we really, really, really have to want it.
Yes.
Because that's the thing. Do Muslims really want this? Is there a concerted effort? Because you and I have had this discussion many times about how, and we're not picking on Muslims of the Anglosphere, but what we see in the Anglosphere is that we ask about why are Muslims in this state? Why is happening this? And it's like, okay, maybe they actually want it to be this way. Maybe
they're comfortable.
Yeah, maybe they don't want. Maybe a lot of these Muslims living in America, maybe they don't want madrasas. Maybe they don't want kutab. Maybe they don't want fuqaha telling them what to do. Yeah. Maybe they're happy with their mortgages and they're happy with their.
And they've become accustomed to it.
Yeah, they're happy. They're happy with their Islam at home and their Islam in the masjid. And outside of that, they want to own a liquor store and they want to send their kids to Catholic schools or whatever it is, and they're not really bothered. Maybe that's what they want. So, out of all those things that these conditions have laid out, the actual desire to make that change has to be there. If people don't have that desire for change, that's what they're happy with. That's what they're happy with. What can we do?
So in closing then, what I'd like for you to do is to reiterate to us where this book was found, where this book can be found, where people can purchase it, and to also close with your current activities and what you're engaged in at the moment, inshallah, and where people can find more of your work.
Okay, so alhamdulillah, so this book, again, it's newly available now from Wondrous Islam. It's an online bookshop in Canada, based in just outside Toronto. So I will put a link below. I put a link below yesterday's video. So if you're in North America, you can order the book. If you're in the UK, there's a shop called Purification in Preston. I have a link on my blog. I'll put a link below this video. It's available there. If you're in Singapore, it's Nawab Books. Put a link. If you're in, I'll link one of the books as well as some copies. If you're in Malaysia, it's Plitete in Kuala Lumpur. They have some copies. And if you're outside those regions, again, if you're in Europe, you can probably get it from the bookshop in Preston. Again, if you're in North America, the bookshop in Canada. If you're in Southeast Asia, this bookshop should suffice. If you would like to have the book like in another region, a bookstore, you can send me, drop me a line through my blog, or you can leave a comment below this video. But there's a contact form on my blog. You can contact me. and I can arrange it with you for Dolphin to send some copies. So that's where the book's available. And in terms of my current activity, I'm currently just working on. There were some studies I was doing. That's why I haven't done a podcast for a while. I was doing some studies. I'll talk about it at a later date. I'm just working on a book by Imam right now, and there's another book by Imam that I translated that will be published maybe later this year. It's kind of like a follow-up to this book, and it's called Al-Insan Without Allah. It's like man and Allah's justice on earth. It talks about a lot of these things and repeats them.
Okay.
But it talks again, like really gets into like that question of, you know, we talked about this before about, you know, the problem of evil.
Yes.
Like why is there so many innocent people in the world suffering, and why there's so many oppressive people living comfortable lives? A really, really important book. So that'll be coming out, inshallah, maybe early 1442, inshallah. So, alhamdulillah, maybe anything.
Alhamdulillah. I have no further questions. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your efforts. We look forward to seeing more from you, inshallah. This has been a very enlightening and breathtaking look at the Imam's works, and we hope, inshallah, to see more of these in the future from you. And I say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.